What can you tell us about this new, amazing secret history of NASA?
Well, it's been a story that's many, many years in the making. I mean, at least 40-some years since the genesis of NASA itself back in 1958. What I'm intrigued with is how it's a story that I've tried to tell before in various venues. I've told it on, the Art Bell Show, Coast to Coast. I've told it at the National Press Club in a press conference that we did with 8 other people, very prestigious background, NASA people, imaging people, in 1996. And it's a story that I've, even told on television. But until we wrote Dark Mission, it hasn't seemed to take root. 2 weeks after the book was published, it became a bestseller on the New York Times bestseller list. In fact, that's what this nice little emblem up in the corner of the book says. That's not a mean feat to do when you've had no national television exposure on such a volume as this. The only exposure we've had, the only way that people found out that we had written a new book and we were looking at the background of NASA and what they've been telling us against the background of who they really are, was on the Coast to Coast audience and on the websites. We have 2 websites, enterprisemission.com, which is the formal website of an Enterprise investigation, and we also have darkmission.net, which is the official website of the new book. I think it's kind of like the old Mark Twain quote, when it's steamboat time, you steam. I think we are politically in this country, actually in the world, particularly after the last 8 years, all of us are ready to get to the truth, to drop the lies. It is so overwhelming now, it is so in our face that people that we have trusted with our lives, our fortunes, our sacred honor, that they've lied to us. And they've looked into the cameras and they have absolutely told us lie after lie after.
So what is the truth? What is the bottom line? And you can build the story however you want. But basically you're saying that NASA has lied to us. In essence, our government has lied to us because they're one and the same, right? They're interwoven in some ways.
Not necessarily. See, this is where people need to think nuance. People need to be much more sophisticated, which of course the 21st century viewer or reader these days is. It isn't the government. There is no such thing as the government. There are several governments, and they're at war with each other. And you see occasionally evidence in public that there is some kind of war, but in fact, most of the time, the nuanced positionings are hidden. It's really almost like the old feudal system. We've all been raised on stories of Robin Hood and Sherwood Forest and the Sheriff of Nottingham and, the King John and the terrible things that were going on in England when Sir Richard, the good guy, the King of England, was off fighting in the Crusades, and the bad guy, John, was basically trying to steal his empire behind his back while he was off doing good deeds. What we're looking at in the current U.S. government, which the Founding Fathers never, in their wildest nightmare, except maybe for, that vision that Washington ostensibly had at Valley Forge, they never imagined that there would be these baronies, these feudal kingdoms, these fiefdoms fighting with each other and with the American people over power. Ultimately, it's all about power.
So name the fiefdoms. Are you willing to do that?
Well, they're out on CNN. There's the Defense Department, and there's the State Department, and there's NASA, and there's the CIA, and all the alphabet agencies. Remember the National Intelligence Estimate that just told us a few days ago that, Iran really isn't developing a nuclear weapon and hasn't been for 4 years, was the compilation of 16 or 17 intelligence agencies that somehow all got together with a consensus and said, okay, we really were mistaken before. They aren't doing what the president has been telling you they're doing for months now, beating the drumbeats of war, threatening World War III. So people are seeing that there is this incredible internal food fight going on in the U.S. government, that there is no one government. There are, in the House and Senate alone, 535 governments. Each member, each representative, each senator has their own perspective when they're actually answerable to their constituents. we identified the 3 secret power groups who are in fact behind and in charge of and fighting with each other for power under the NASA emblem. And they are, because I can see that's where you want to go, they are the Nazis, the Masons,
wow.
and the magicians.
Very good. Very good. So that's actually stunning that you would actually name them, at least at that level.
Why is it stunning? It's the truth.
Because very few people will.
But that's what Dark Mission's all about, to tell people the truth. Because,
Right.
you know, it's, well, and one of the mantras that we have throughout Dark Mission is a line that was actually given to me by one of these intel agents. You know, you get calls from these people, you actually even have dinner with them, they come to conferences, you never really know how much of what they're telling you is the truth and how much is spin, how much is a veiled lie with a bit of truth embedded, otherwise no one will ever buy it. Mm-hmm. So you're constantly making decisions when you rely on sources, which we at Enterprise really try not to do, and I'll expand on that in a minute. This individual gave me a stunningly interesting line. In fact, it probably was the second most important thing that anybody in public life has ever told me. The first was my old friend Gene Roddenberry, which I'll get back to in a second. This intel agent said to me in one of our early conversations, reiterated over and over again, it's become kind of like an in-joke, you know, when we're on the phone talking to each other. The lie is different at every level. Meaning that even the people who are in front of the camera spinning, telling you that the world is coming to an end, telling you that the dollar is crashing, telling you that we're running out of oil, telling you that we have to nuke Iran before they nuke us, telling you that, you know, Saddam had weapons of mass destruction, most of those people really believe what they're telling you. Mm-hmm. Because they've been told lies by people that they trust.
Right.
So the lie goes up the line. Every little group is controlled and contained and constrained by being fed exactly how much BS they will believe. So they can come out in front of the cameras at like the National Press Club or at the White House when the president's spokesperson comes out. She believes 99% of the stuff she's saying. She's not in on the lie. She doesn't know it's a lie, because if she did, she couldn't be the actress that she is.
Exactly.
The lie has to be different at every level in order for the entire assemblage of lies to ultimately control all the rest of us and to contain the truth.
Fast forward, here we are. You've written this incredible book, and tell us that little story that you were telling us before about, you know, the moment on television, etc. I mean, because it's not real until it's TV.
Well, when I got into this, when I started looking at data, as opposed to, you know, the mountain thing was just stupidity. But when I started looking at data was on the occasion of the JPL unmanned Viking probes in 1976, where I was, again, a representative of CBS News at JPL for that incredible, unbelievable Viking summer. That's what we called it, the Viking summer. When this nation, on the bicentennial year, sent 2 unmanned spacecraft to land on Mars for the first time, and 2 more to orbit, you know, taking hundreds of thousands of pictures. And it launched the official investigation of the possibility of life on Mars. Well, somewhat after this process began, somewhere around the 25th, I think, of July, one of the key guys in the Viking mission, his name was Dr. Jerry Soffin, stood up in front of us in the JPL. Now, we're now in California at Jet Propulsion Laboratory, JPL, which I think you have more than a passing knowledge of. And Soffin stood up and he, on the screen, projected kind of like this, a picture showing the face on Mars. That quirky thing with the little black specks on it, you know, with a kind of a snarled lip that has been in every book everywhere on the planet over the last 30 or so years. And he pointed to it and he said, you know, isn't it funny what tricks of light and shadow can do? Big laugh from all us assembled press people. When we took a picture a few hours later, it all went away. It was just a trick of light and shadow. So I'm there. I'm another witness to this statement, to this process. Fast forward the film. I get into the process of actually looking at this picture decades later in the 1980s, in the late 80s, around 89. And I find that everything that Soppen told us also was a lie. It wasn't a trick of light and shadow. When you do the actual computer processing, it's a stunningly symmetrical statue, 1.5 miles long and half a mile high, and we've had umpteen images now. We've had other independent, computerized enhancements of the various data. There's 3D modeling, there's stereo, there's shape from shading, there's all kinds of analysis, all of it, by the way, performed by us outside NASA. NASA has ignored and simply told everybody it's just nonsense, go away, go away. Gosh, NASA says that, amazing. But the key moment was, and when I went back through the timeline, is that Jerry's statement, and I can call him Jerry because I knew him pretty well, was also a lie. There was no picture taken of the face on Mars a few hours later. Technically, a few hours later, as Mars rotated and the orbit of the Viking camera changed, that region of Mars was in darkness. They couldn't take a picture. The next opportunity to take a picture was 1 month later, actually 35 days. And the picture was taken, which is unusual because at that time in the mission they hardly ever took 2 pictures of the same piece of real estate, and they had to wait a month to come back in the geometry and take the second picture, which of course, if you look at it from the outside, somebody was checking that if it was the same thing there on the second frame at a different sun angle, science says it's probably real. It probably was a real face. It was a real statue. It was a real enigma, a real incredible breakthrough in what NASA and Viking claimed they were searching for, life on Mars. Except, of course, they lied to us. They lied to us. They lied to us. And they've been lying on this subject for 30 years. That's what got me into asking, is it really that they're lying, or are they just fools? Are they scientists who have no conception of how real science should operate, which is that when you see something so stunningly in the middle of your paradigm, you have a mission, you have a whole taxpayer-funded mission, billions of dollars spent looking for life on Mars. Well, a mile-wide statue kind of is life. It's built by somebody, maybe. So isn't the scientific method to check it out? No, instead of checking it out, they ran at warp 9 in the other direction.
Okay, but if they were lying back then, and that was one of the first missions to Mars.
It was the first landing and orbital mission. Then
they must have been prepared to lie. I mean, isn't that the supposition? They knew what they were going to find? Is this where the secret space program was already in operation prior to this mission?
Okay, this now gets a little technical. Viking was not the first mission to Mars. The first was Mariner 4 in 1965. The second was Mariner 6 and 7 that occurred during the Apollo summer when I was covering the first manned landings on the moon with Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. And we went from North American Rockwell, where we had built a whole studio complex, including a walk-through solar system, which was my idea. And we went up the street, up the hill to JPL to finish covering the Apollo return, because they were about halfway between Earth and Moon. And we had also covered the Mariner 6 flyby and 7 flyby of Mars, the second unmanned missions. And then the third unmanned mission that was sent to Mars by this country, by the United States, was in 1971. It was called Mariner 9. But as opposed to being a flyby, where you basically take a few shots as you go away forever, it was the first U.S. spacecraft to go into orbit around Mars. And it radically transformed all our thinking. So as I reconstruct history, I'm looking at the Viking images of Cydonia, of the face on Mars, and I'm saying that there have to exist somewhere. We have not found them. They're not in any public file. There have to exist secret images taken by Mariner 9 in 1971. Because Viking was 76, you've got 72, 73, 74, 75, 5 years to have predetermined there was something really interesting down there on the plains of Cydonia. Okay. So when we put Viking into orbit, they knew exactly where to take the new, much better pictures.
Okay, so I'm assuming that you're talking about ruins that they knew about, they had prior knowledge. And you're saying they had prior knowledge because they had a prior they had another space program.
That's one level of the prior knowledge.
Right.
That we can prove.
Okay.
Unquestionably we can prove, except we haven't found the missing Mariner 9 images. We found Mariner 9 images of other interesting things that were discussed. Sagan and Cosmos talked about the pyramids of Elysium. They're these huge, several-mile wide tetrahedral pyramids located halfway around the planet from Cydonia. And in one of Carl Sagan's books, he actually relates them in an interesting metaphorical passage to each other. And I don't remember the details, but I thought it was strikingly intriguing, both at the time and in hindsight, that Carl would connect those dots. But that's the only pretty hard data we have. We know we had a spacecraft on station, Mariner 9. We know we had another spacecraft come along 5 years later, Viking. It's logical to assume if we had really good shots, perfectly framed, of the face on Mars and the pyramids from Viking, that they could have had prior knowledge from the lower resolution images from Mariner 9. That's not a stretch, that's not a leap at all. What I think gets really interesting is when you begin to ask the question, is it possible they knew there was something there to photograph at all from a long, long time ago in a history far, far away? And that gets back to the three groups running NASA inside: the Nazis, the Masons, and the magicians.
Okay.
Because two of those groups, the Nazis and the Masons, we know had textual evidence, ancient documents, stuff, text, books, records left over from a long time ago. That's kind of like their shooting script. They've been using it to basically go around the solar system and take pictures of stuff that they have intimations exist out there but don't have scientific proof.
Okay, so you're talking about ancient texts. What kind of ancient texts? Do you know the names of them? Have you seen them? Are they at all out in the public domain?
Yes and no. And I'm trying to now remember the specifics because there's so much mythology that, in fact, as you begin to get into it, looks more like mangled history. Mm-hmm. We do know, for instance, that Himmler set up a whole section of the SS to do nothing but go around the world and steal all the good stuff, all the ancient stuff. Right. In fact, I was so anticipating when Spielberg came out with the film, Raiders of the Lost Ark, that he was going to really blow the doors off and show us that the Ark and all the stuff the Nazis were intrigued with was not something out of the Old Testament. It was, in fact, ancient technology buried on this planet, accessible from previous epochs of civilization, some of whom could have built spaceships and gone to Mars and done the stuff we see there. But that's not the direction he went.
Okay, but you're saying that's true.
Well, I'm saying it's possible.
Okay.
I'm not saying it's true. I'm saying it's possible.
Okay.
And remember, a lot of this has to do with perception. You know, there's an old cliche that politics is 99% perception. It doesn't matter if something is true. If politically people perceive it to be true and then act upon that belief, that can make it true. Mm-hmm. So let's say that these two groups who have access to secret information, ancient texts, the Nazis and the Masons, that they believed that there once was a civilization on Mars, for whatever reason. And they went there when they controlled the space program looking for that evidence. And bingo, they found it. That 21st century, I was 20th century then, confirmation then validates the hints and rumors and intimations in those ancient texts.
Sure. So
the text was
are you positing that the Nazis had a space program?
No.
No.
They wanted to. They were building toward it.
Okay.
I'm looking now very seriously into the possibilities for that kind of technology that early on. What I find is a very interesting pattern as we get deeper and deeper into the whole Nazi era, who they were, what they believed, where they came from, their lineal roots, which goes back much further, it looks like, hundreds of years, than the brief flurry just after World War I leading up to World War II. The Nazi philosophy, the idea that human beings are not from this planet, that there's this special race of Aryans, Aries, Mars, duh, that may in fact be grounded in some ancient documents which have been super secret, kept and revered and deified almost, is not beyond reality. I just don't happen to have copies with me this afternoon. I'd love to see some.
Okay, are you in touch with scholars, for example,
Yes,
that are
yes.
specializing in that area?
Absolutely. In fact,
that's a real deep...
one of them is a really cool guy that you guys should interview. His name is Joseph Farrell.
Okay.
He is in South Dakota. He will be here in January. He's coming here so we can have he's an Oxford scholar. He's an Oxford PhD. Mm-hmm. He's written 5 books on this subject. He meticulously footnotes, documents, tracks, references, unearths amazing memos and a paper trail. And he has given me, as a serious scholar, who also was a pretty nice guy, an amazing new window on the antecedents for the Nazis that the U.S. government brought over, buried in the core of our own space program, who seem to have had their own agenda, apart from Eisenhower, Kennedy, and the American people.
Okay, so you say, what do you say, Werner von Braun? Mm-hmm. You say...
Kurt Debus.
I'm sorry?
Kurt Debus.
Okay.
Who seems to have been somehow involved in efforts to create an amazingly interesting alternative rocket technology that's not rocket-based for space travel.
Free energy-based?
Field propulsion.
Torsion-based?
Field propulsion,
okay.
Which is a way of manipulating space-time. So on the one hand you get anti-gravity, on the other hand you get free energy.
Okay, so when was he operating?
Kurt Debus?
Yeah.
From paperclip through the entire Apollo program.
So this is the end of the World War II.
World War II, through the 50s, into the 60s, into the 70s, and he was made the head of Cape Canaveral / Cape Kennedy after Kennedy was assassinated. And he has this entire secret background that never once has come out in any official document from NASA or any other place.
Now, how do you know about him?
Because of Joseph Farrell and his stunning research. Okay. He's got German documents. He reads German. That helps. Mm-hmm. You know, you've got real scholarship. We have always been, those of us looking at this cutting edge of the transition between fake history and real history, we've always been limited by the fact that there have been basically a field of amateurs. Some of them are talented amateurs, some of them are idiot amateurs. I have a phrase which of course has been made true over and over again: amateurs can get you killed. But people like Farrell are not amateurs. Mm-hmm. And when they have turned their expertise in scholarship, trained at a place like Oxford, on this problem, you wind up with 5 amazing books that document page after page after page a real hidden history, the alternatives to what the Nazis were doing technologically and politically, and how they almost seamlessly continued by going from one set of sponsors, i.e. Hitler et al., right, to another set of sponsors, i.e. the U.S. government et al., without even a break for lunch.
Okay.
And in the book, we have this stunning picture of von Braun and all these paperclip scientists standing under a kind of a cute Western motif. It's a sign hung on spindles up above the assembled scientists. And it's a UFO. It's an actual cutout in the shape of an unidentified flying object / saucer craft.
Okay.
And in the middle of it, there's this big swastika.
Oh,
this is in the United States of America after we won the war.
Right.
And these guys are on shore leave, away from White Sands into El Paso. This was a curio shop. It's called Bob's Curio Shop. And the photographs, the enlargements are in the book. And of course, the reason that the swastika on it is so stunningly important, as we describe in rather great detail in the book, is because the swastika was a symbol that Hitler stole from history, going all the way back to the Vedas, this ancient Indian tradition that talks about spacecraft and nuclear weapons and vimanas and all kinds of astonishing high-tech stuff back at a time when there should be no such high-tech stuff. And what Hitler did was to take it, co-opt it, and use it for his own political and propaganda purposes very consciously, because what the swastika is an insight into an entire different level of reality, which I term hyperdimensional physics, out of which you get, on the one hand, if you really do it right, anti-gravity, making rockets obsolete, and then free energy. making centralized power plants and centralized power and the control of people through the price of oil also obsolete. So on both hands, you've got under proven now Nazi research and development efforts during and after World War II. You've got the keys to liberating civilization all over this planet. 6 billion people freed. And someone is sitting on that truth, and it's one of those three groups running NASA secretly, the Nazis. Very useful.
So, but what I'm wondering now is, so we've got these three groups. You've talked about the Nazis and the...
We only talk about two so
far.
Right,
but that's where I'm going, is what I want to know.
We haven't really talked about the Masons yet.
Well, not a whole lot. No, not at all, really. So take us to the Masons and the magicians, and how do they work into NASA, along with the Nazis?
Well, the Masons, of course, founded the United States.
Okay.
I mean, Masonic tradition of philosophy is a stunningly important adjunct to the advancement and evolution of the human species. To, you know, the old Army phrase, be all that you can be. Masons are not bad guys. Masons are good guys.
Are we talking about Freemasons?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. They are the heirs apparent of the Templars, you know, from the Middle Ages, who became very powerful by finding something in Jerusalem, you know, under the Temple Mount. They became the most powerful organization in Europe. They literally, you know, owned Europe, in essence. They created a free banking system. They created so many modern institutions that we would recognize, you know, when you go to your ATM. And then Philip the Fair, the King of France, in 1307, on a Friday the 13th, lowered the boom and killed a lot of them, imprisoned most of them, chased some of them, and never found a lot of the important stuff that they were keeping secret, including an awful lot of money. An awful lot of money. And the rumors have been that the money was stashed up at a place called Oak Island, and that's why FDR and other Masons periodically have funded or gotten private funding to go and try to dig it up. And that's a whole other story for a whole other video.
Sure. What about the magicians?
The fact is that the Masons were the good guys. Now, when you are, I mean, James Webb, who was Kennedy's administrator of NASA, handpicked, was a 33rd degree Mason. The problem with all this is we're trying to do forensics from outside the system. We don't have people inside saying, this is why they're hiding this is why they're hiding that. And even if we did, would we believe them? A lie is different at every level, and they have their set of lies that they're being told. So to really do this, you have to rely on the evidence itself. And then you have to rank that evidence in terms of the political realities of the entire culture in which you live, i.e. the United States, or the larger culture in which we live, which is the world. And when I look at the world, and I look at what's going on right now, the most intense fractional confrontations, the reasons for more bloodletting, more slaughter, more pain, more suffering, more conflict on this planet than any other, is the religious idea that my God is bigger than your God. In fact, your God isn't anything and you aren't anything either. And when you look at the presidential debates this year, what has come to the fore? Overwhelmingly, again and again and again, the religious background of the candidates. The Founding Fathers, that whirring sound you hear in the background is the Founding Fathers spinning in their graves, because they tried to set up a political system where we separated politics from religion. Politics from our metaphysical ideas of who we are, what we are doing on this planet, who our creator is, etc., etc. And what we're seeing as the 21st century evolves, even in these first few years, is a blending and a fusion of religious perspectives with the body politic. And you just look at what the schism is now that is confronting everyone, which has given us the freedom, I'm using that in quotes, to create the patriot subversions of the Constitution, to create the NSA eavesdropping. It's all about religion. It's these bad guys, those nasty terrorist Muslims, the conflict of civilizations, that those people are out to basically ultimately kill all of us. You know, the only good Muslim is a dead Muslim, which of course is what the radicals on our side are saying, even though they claim that's not what they're saying. So we're living in a levels of illusion where at the base it's all about religious difference and religious intolerance and religious obsession that my God is the only God and you deserve to be killed because you don't believe in my God. So when you go to the moon, like what I have on the screen, and as part of the Apollo program, you find what appears to be the head of a robot, a sentient being created by something greater than humankind and lesser than the angels, etc., etc. And then you see that in our own fiction, in George Lucas's Star Wars, there is this stunning similarity in our popular cultural mythos. The question has to arise, who in NASA knew what when and were terrified to tell us because of the religious implications? Now, if you look at ruins on the moon, or you look at ruins on Mars, particularly if you have a mile-long face on Mars, mile plus or minus, and it looks like us, remember there's this key phrase in the Old Testament, God created man in His image. Oh, wait a minute. If that's true, then what is this mile-long face doing lying on Mars? Mars isn't mentioned in the Old Testament. Who were the Martians? Were they created in God's image? Is that God's image lying in the debris?
Okay, but let's get to this truth. What you're telling me is the truth is that the ruins on the Mars and Moon indicate that we are not alone.
Oh, that's not the issue. The issue is, are we involved? Are they our ruins? Okay. As part of our lunar investigation, going back now to 1996, which is 11 years, I brought in a variety of experts in Enterprise to look at various aspects of this impossible-to-believe story at first hand. Namely, that Apollo went to the moon. The astronauts went there specifically chartered by NASA, by the President, as a mandate to go and find the technology secretly and bring it back and back-engineer it. And that the Apollo, the race with the Russians to get to the moon before them, was a cover story. And we know that now because we have memos, which are in the book, in Dark Mission, from the White House, from the State Department. We have testimony from Premier Khrushchev's own son, Sergei, who was a fellow, I think, at Brown University, who confirms that from the moment that Kennedy walked into the Oval Office in 1960, after he was inaugurated on that afternoon of January 20th, he opened a dialogue with Premier Khrushchev, attempting to get him to go to the moon together. Now, logically, this is nuts. Because if we're told all these years that the reason we went to the moon was to beat the Russians, why were we going to the moon at all? Spending all that money at all? Doing anything out there? If it wasn't to beat the Russians, if in fact secretly we were trying to go with the Russians? The only logical answer is there was something there that Kennedy felt was of overriding importance to humankind, to civilization, no matter where it is on this planet, that we had to share with our arch enemies in the Cold War. And ultimately, as we document in the book, it looks like they killed him for it. And then a few months later, they imprisoned Khrushchev and kept him under house arrest until his death, several years after that.
But ultimately, behind the scenes, we may have gone to the moon with them anyway. Isn't this right?
We don't know. Again,
Okay.
we don't know.
Okay.
The gaps in the record are still big enough to fly the Enterprise through. What we do know is that we went. That Apollo went to the moon. We had 6 missions, incredible missions. We had one that didn't quite work the way we wanted it to, 13, which in itself has interesting gaps that I'm looking at in my copious spare time. But what we know now from the photographs they brought back, the photographs that I have looked at in the NASA archives physically, held them in my hands, photographs now leaked all over the web, all over NASA websites, all over the world for anybody to download and use a modicum of image processing like Photoshop or Corel Draw or whatever to basically turn up the gain, turn up the brightness. Look at what's in the sky, which should be totally black. You'll find this. Now, this is actually a perfect, idealized version of what you're going to find. This is a grid created by one of our experts, an architect named Robert Feartech, who we talk about in the book, who I brought into this back in the mid-90s to analyze the photographs and tell us what was there from a structural, constructional perspective. So what Robert did is created this grid in the computer. And then what we did was to look at some of the photographs. For instance, this is a Hasselblad image from Apollo 10. The frame number is AS1032-4810. So you can go to the archive and go to the website, download this picture, and you can see there are hints that there's something in the sky, really classic lunar terrain below. All you do is turn up the brightness. Remember that song, Turn Up the Volume? You turn up the gain. And you see this stunning grid work in the sky. Grid work which, this is a close-up now, does not belong. It's three-dimensional. It's rectilinear. It's girders up and down. It's stringers left and right. There's no doubt in anyone's mind who has anything to do with construction, has even built a house, that this is real. It's not scratches. It's not image weirdness in the chemistry path of the developing of the film. It's real 3D manufactured stuff.
Okay.
And it doesn't
so
belong
what's
there.
your theory on who manufactured that?
Well, that goes back to the photograph I showed you a few minutes ago, which was the head.
Oh.
Well, the head is kind of anthropomorphic, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
If we believe in biological evolution, if we believe in Gaylord Simpson, who was the expert at Harvard back in the 1960s, who laid out this kind of Bible of human development, which Carl Sagan then ran with. Human beings are totally unique. The way we look, our face, our features, our proportions, 2 arms, 2 legs, all that, if you were to run Earth's history again, you wouldn't get anything looking like us at all. And the reason they say is because if you look in the oceans, you look on land, you look at all the various species, you look at the extinct species, look at the fossil record, the only guys that look like us, we now know are genetically related. The simians, the anthropoids, the apes, the monkeys. You know, there's a family tree here. Darwin was right. There is a family to which we have somehow been derived.
And perhaps some of the extraterrestrial visitors as well. I don't know.
We don't know that. We don't know that. You know, again, I'm dealing with actual data I can touch. I do not do UFOs because I have to depend on stories. If you're depending on stories, you're at the mercy of anybody telling you the story. If you depend on actual documented evidence that's in an archive that anybody can download, you're in a completely different ballgame. And so I listen to the stories. I try to cross-correlate them with the data, but we are data-bound. That's what makes Enterprise different from anybody else trying to do this thing. We have data.
Okay, so anthropomorphically, they look like us.
Yes.
What has that got to do with what you're finding on the moon?
I'm getting there.
Okay.
Yes. I always try to get someplace.
Sure.
Right? So back to the robot head.
Yes.
Why does the robot look like us? It could look like anything. It could look like R2-D2. Remember, R2-D2 did not look like us at all.
Right.
He's cute and, like almost like a little trash can, with blinking lights and a beam and all that. He looks like C-3PO, who is an anthropomorphic robot in human image. So the fact that Apollo went to the moon and on Apollo 17, Gene Cernan and Harrison Schmitt may have seen that thing. They may have picked it up. They may have brought it back as part of their mandate. We don't know any of those facts yet because they're not talking.
Why do we have a photograph of it?
There are like 15 photographs of it.
I know, but did they take the pictures?
They took the pictures. But when you take a picture on the moon, remember, they're not looking through a viewfinder. The camera was strapped to their chest. I have a photo. The fact is, the only way you aim the camera was with your body in your spacesuit.
Okay.
And you're sitting behind a glass.
Hasselblad.
Hasselblad, very high quality camera, but they're not looking at the scene. They're looking at the scene and they're taking pictures by moving their whole body, so they may not have even seen this. It was so far away. It's in the bottom of a crater which is the size of a football field.
Well, who found it?
I did.
You did?
I'm the first guy to find it, of course. What do you think? That's why you're here, aren't you?
Okay,
That's what we
no,
do over here.
Okay, yeah.
You know, read the book.
You found a robot head in a photograph in the bottom
In
of the
14 photographs. It was photographed
Amazing.
again and again and again and again
Okay.
as part of the panorama sequence.
Okay.
We are trying now to go, we've gotten 2 copies of film, not just the web, but film, which is really crappy copies that were sent to us. And what I was able to do, edit, put computer robot comparison with C3PO, I was able to take 2 of those images and superimpose them very carefully, one on top of the other. This is a standard photo technique for amplifying signal and averaging noise, because every photograph has noise. If you do that, the mathematical equation says that you drive down the noise by the square root of the number of frames you can successfully, carefully superimpose. Ultimately, we got 14 frames to play with. I need higher resolution, but I've done some playing around in the computer with even those frames, and you get very interesting results. The 2 frames that were actually film that we used, we were able to superimpose them, and that's when the eyes popped out. The round irises, the camera eyes that tell me this is not a desiccated human being lying there on the moon. One of the lunar colonists that we were positing was there at one point. This is an artificial life form, a robot. We've called it Data's head. Doesn't look like Data, it looks much more like C3PO, which opens the whole doorway to what does George Lucas know and when did he know it. And if you want, I can go there and really curl your eyebrows, because we have more data that Lucas is involved up to his eyebrows in this whole interesting story and plot and conspiracy. And that's why George Lucas is so successful with those films. It's not an accident.
Okay, now I do want to go there.
We'll go there in a
we
minute.
have time to go there. Phil?
Yeah, I have a question, Richard, if I may, which I know has been asked by some other people. I could understand how Data's head could have been captured on film accidentally, because it was quite a while back and they weren't focusing
14 times.
Hasselblads. But with these very large structures that you've identified on your photographs, these would clearly have been in the background for the astronauts who were taking those images. Why would they have permitted those images to be in the background and all they have to do is to take the photograph the other way?
This is a photograph taken from Apollo 14. This is a photograph taken by Alan Shepard, who was the commander. Looking north, here's Edgar Mitchell, who I debated about all this on Art Bell show in 1996. Here's Mitchell's shadow. Here's the incredible background dome that's arching over Mitchell that he's apparently totally oblivious to. And here is an inset area where, because I have an original print of this priceless image, saved from deliberate destruction by NASA by a gentleman named Ken Johnston in 1971, I believe, saved for 30 years and then physically handed to me in Seattle in 1995, where I was able to put it on a computer scanner, which is pretty primitive then compared to what we have now, scan it, turn up the brightness, turn up the gain, and bingo, out popped all this astonishing geometry. When I zoomed in on the print, because I could scan it at higher and higher resolutions, I found a succeeding series of really amazing, detailed versions of what was on the frame. You can see that at the horizon there is this lateral scaffolding, that there are angled, what we call them is buttresses, that come down at an angle from somewhere in the distance. There's multiple leveled three-dimensional cross bracing. There's something here that looks like a bullet hole in a windshield, like I took a 45 and shot, so the glass is all shattered all around it, scattering light. Notice the color. The color is real. This is buried in the blue emulsion layers of the multi-layered ectochrome of the original ASA-64 film that they took to the moon and shot all those pictures with. They didn't make prints. They made transparencies. Then in the darkroom, they made intermediate prints. And in the darkroom, Bill, to answer your question, they took out all the good stuff.
But they
simply erased it in the darkroom.
And they didn't have colour film on the first...
No, they did. No, they had color film. In fact, they had a super color film, which is a whole other story. I actually knew the inventor at EG&G who invented it. I tracked using it. I actually had rolls of it to use myself. When I was at CBS, I went to the Cape. I had a huge gun camera built for me by one of the key photographers in the press corps. I think he was a freelance guy. He worked for AP, he worked for Newsweek, People magazine, whatever. He actually built this huge camera. It looked like a rifle. And I would aim it like that with a trigger that would trigger the 35 millimeter camera with this special film. And I took photographs of the launch of the Saturn V on Apollo 8, the first mission to the moon. CBS then flew me by helicopter from New York to Boston, where the lab was, and out to the lab, and Charlie, my friend Charlie Wyckoff, developed while I watched that film. I then took the helicopter back to New York, and we put the film on the air to show what the Saturn V launch would look like with this incredible super extended range color film, which NASA had developed secretly to take to the moon. They then destroyed the lab that was built specifically to make this film.
NASA destroyed the lab.
NASA destroyed the lab. Well, Kodak, at NASA's behest. Because Charlie was asked to give the film to Kodak as part of a evaluation for eventually putting it out in the marketplace. So you and I could basically have, that's, by the way, what's the gold film now that is commercially available in drugstores. That's a version of Charlie's super wide latitude color transparency film. It was taken to the moon. They used it to take the first generation pictures with those Hasselblad cameras. They then brought it back to the darkrooms in Houston. They then made intermediate generational copies and prints. And in the darkroom, all the offending ruins were removed.
Yes.
This is why this print is so important, because this is from a first generation unaltered print without the things taken off. This is now the inset showing Mitchell and showing where we did this and showing the stunning three-dimensional geometry of the glass. We call this Mitchell under glass. And yet when I talked to him on the Bell Show and debated him, he claimed to have seen nothing. And I gave him a pass at that time because I thought that part of the problem had to do with the fact that he literally could not see. This is now a close-up showing what I call the bullet hole. Notice all the 3D geometry, this amazing three-dimensional lattice, and you can see the stair steps of brilliant glass shining, and the lunar surface is overexposed. Because remember, this is very dim. This is probably the consistency of cigarette smoke. It is so fine because it's been beaten and beaten and beaten to death by an incessant micrometeoric rain. So after how many millions of years, there's almost nothing left. But there was enough left to take pictures and bring them home.
To piggyback on Bill's question, why would they leave any trace? Do they want someone to find it? Did they want you to find it?
Let me continue the logic train, and we'll get to that.
Okay.
This is a curve, a light curve of human visual sensitivity. Our visual sensitivity peaks in what's called the yellow-green, which is where the solar spectrum peaks, by the way, so that's probably not an accident. And as you can see, as we go toward the red end of the spectrum, it gets really low down here. This is the sensitivity curve. This is 100%. This would be 0. So it's really way down in the noise. And as you get toward the blue and the violet, it gets very noisy. So you really don't see, at low light levels, much of anything in the blue or the red. You may see a little bit in the green. But film, of course, has a very different sensitivity. So now we come to the astronauts. Each astronaut was outfitted, we were told, with a gold visor designed to protect them from ultraviolet light, like a sunscreen or Polaroid sunglasses or whatever. That's another NASA lie. I can prove it. Watch. If you look at the transmission curve of gold on plastic, and you look at the spectrum, and you look at the gold helmet, it turns out that the gold suppressed all the visible wavelengths of the bright lunar surface under shining bright sunlight and amplified the blue, meaning that those helmets allowed them to actually look out at the lunar surface and see the ruins of the domes. So they could aim their body cameras at any particular place to get the pictures of the ruins, which are pervasive and all over. So there's no way they could have pointed the camera where there weren't ruins, because they were inside an ancient shattered dome of glass where 360 degrees, this is a 360-degree panorama taken from one of the panoramas that Ken Johnson saved from the original prints, and you can see that most of the stuff is to the west, backscattering. Notice the geometry here. Then as you move the camera around to the north, this is where Mitchell, this is Mitchell again. This is where the grid work was that we showed in close-up. Then you look toward the sun over here, and toward the south. There's much less over here. You can see that it's almost dark, the way it would be if there was no glass. And then finally back to the west again as it begins to build up in what we call backscatter, where the light is kicked back. So this panorama, taken from an original NASA print, saved from destruction by Johnson 30 years ago, somehow this print knows where the sun is. And there's no way that any accident of chemistry, development, bad lighting, light leaks, whatever. I mean, a light leak would be toward the sun, right? Why is the biggest portion of backscatter in the sky directly opposite the sun as judged by the astronaut's shadow? In other words, his very body is shielding the camera lens from seeing any sunlight.
Now, I know that some people watching this will want us to ask this question and they want to hear your answer. And that is, some people say that you've got hold of a conspiracy, but you've got hold of the wrong one, because what you've got hold of here is evidence of back structures on a big screen in the Nevada desert, like the Truman Show. And that's what was actually being kept quiet. Now, it's not a stupid question, but I'm sure you can't answer it. Let's hear it.
We go into the book of this in great detail. To my mind, there is zero probability, and I rarely use the word zero probability, that the lunar landings were faked, given all the politics, given the Nazi backstory of what they were looking for, given von Braun, given the Kennedy-Khrushchev thing. Why would we go if there wasn't something there to go for? But the actual proof that this is not done in a studio and is actually for real comes from an anecdotal story of my own eyewitness testimony, meaning I was at JPL when we made the transition from Downey up to JPL to cover the Mariner 6 and Mariner 7 mission. And I was there as someone in the auditorium being squired around by the head of NASA Public Affairs for JPL, named Frank Bristow, was walking this guy around who was putting some little pamphlet on every reporter's seat in the auditorium, and then was led outside to hand personally a copy of this memo, whatever it was, to every reporter who was in the press room waiting for one of the press conferences to begin. So I got one and I read it, and I was flabbergasted, because here was a guy being officially sponsored by a NASA official handing out a document that said the entire Apollo 11 mission was just completed in a studio, a soundstage in Nevada. The whole thing is a fake. And I wished I had kept that document. We're now looking for some reporter who at the time actually, as a sidebar, as a kind of a, you know, isn't it cute what things happen around these missions, actually published a story based on that 2-page Mimeo handout, because somebody had to have done it. Possibly at the Pasadena Star News, which is one place we're looking, possibly even in the New York Times. I haven't looked. I haven't had time to look. The point is that there were other reporters, both well-known and no one will ever hear of them, reporters. 1,000 people were covering those missions in those days. Somebody had to have kept, just as an historical anachronism, a copy of that memo. Now, what that means, as I say in Dark Mission, is politically, NASA itself was starting the rumor before Neil and Buzz and Mike Collins even got home that Apollo was a fake. Why would NASA, in their wildest dreams, be starting a rumor that would mature 30 years down the road? The answer is inoculation. The answer is that if it ever came out that there was real stuff there that they were hiding, they could divert the conspiracy crowd to the fake conspiracy that we never went to the moon, by planting the seeds, by planting the meme in the culture generations before, which would then bear fruit, which it did on Fox Television. Gosh, Fox Television, that's interesting. And it would divert those people from asking the real question, which of course is, what did they find on the moon, and when did they find it, and when did they decide to lie about it for all these years?
So the astronauts, even Mitchell, you're saying, had a visor that actually made it possible for them to see this wall of glass,
So they could take the
or
pictures of the
dome
right
or whatever,
stuff.
and photograph it.
Yeah.
So when you asked Mitchell and he said he didn't see anything, what is your theory on why he's lying?
See, Carrie is like a good attorney. She knows the answer to the question. She never asks a question where she doesn't know the answer. So I will give her the answer now that she knows. I think Ed Mitchell is telling the absolute truth.
Okay, now this
Now,
answer I don't know.
Ah, so she didn't know the answer.
No?
Because she hasn't read that part of Dark Mission.
That's right.
The reason, the resolution of this paradox is that Ed Mitchell has had something happen to his mind.
Oh, that answer I did know. Okay.
The astronauts,
Okay.
I believe, have been tampered with.
Yes.
There are all kinds of papers now coming out in the open literature about technologies which can selectively wipe out your memories on specific events. And I believe, and I have in the book, Mike and I carefully put in document after document after document of reference to all of the astronauts at one time or another have complained about not being able to remember what they did on the moon.
Yes,
and they come up with
absolutely.
various rationales.
Yes.
You know, like some of them, like Pete Conrad, used to come up with a flip answer. Oh, it was real super gee whiz, golly boy, was it great. Which was a cover for the fact that he was very frustrated in private conversations on the record with certain reporters that he couldn't remember. We had a conference in Wyoming several years ago. Wyoming is a hotbed of CIA and ex-Intel guys who are all bought big, beautiful farms and ranches so they'll keep their mouth shut. They're basically bought off. That's how they're bought off. I was invited to present data on Mars by one of these former CIA big rancher types who had a very beautiful wife who happened to be a medical doctor. Without mentioning names, because they're still alive and I would like to keep them alive, things got really, really, really weird. Because I was ostensibly invited to present the Mars data, Cydonia, our work, at the UN, our expose and the NASA briefings, at NASA Lewis on Mars. And suddenly, I surprised them by presenting a whole bunch of stuff for the first time on the moon. And this individual freaked out.
Oh, wow.
And his wife, who it turned out had been one of the doctors who had debriefed the astronauts, the crew, she orbited around the conference, never even coming in, talking to some of the people who were there with us and saying, I don't know why this is so disturbing, but I just can't sit through this. So it's the old
Amazing.
who watches the watchers. Even, I believe, she had had her mind altered so she would not remember the truth after she had done. So how far up the chain does this go? How many watchers have they had to change their minds with some technology? And the technology is not perfect. I think we're seeing evidence that the technology again and again breaks down. If you read, for instance, Buzz Aldrin's first-person testimony in his own books, he talks about how Jay Barbary, who was a colleague of mine from NBC News, I knew Jay back when I was with Cronkite. I was just a young whippersnapper, and Jay is now this senior space correspondent still covering the shuttle for NBC, asking very perceptive questions from the press corps. Jay innocently invited Buzz to I think it was a Kiwanis Club meeting up in Palmdale, which is one of the NASA facilities north of Los Angeles, where they, in fact, have tested a lot of the components of the secret space program and the secret military program, including the shuttle. And so he invites him into this meeting, a whole bunch of rah-rah, jet jockeys and engineers, and, the old slap you on the back, good old boy network. You know exactly what I'm talking about. And he asks, they're sitting on stage, and they got two chairs, and it's like very conversation. And he says to Buzz, Jay asked Buzz, well, what did it feel like to walk on the moon for the first time? And in his own book, Buzz Aldrin says that at that moment he became violently ill. He had to rush off the stage. He went out to the alley and he threw up.
Wow.
And his wife came out all upset because she thought something was seriously wrong, which of course it was. This is classic aversion therapy. Classic aversion therapy. So yes, I believe the astronauts are blameless. All except for Neil Armstrong.
Okay.
I think Neil Armstrong fully has his memories. I think Neil Armstrong, as the icon, first person of the human family now to walk on the moon, has been left alone. And that is why Neil Armstrong never says anything in public about the space program. They wind him up and bring him out at a couple of these ceremonies. Like in 1994, he was at the White House with President Clinton and a bunch of students, and it was a whole arranged photo op. And he stands there making a speech, and I had someone the other night analyze the body language and his voice and talk about how incredibly nervous and incredibly upset he appeared to be, which you can see on tape. We have the tape. And what he started out by doing was comparing all the astronauts, the entire astronaut corps, all his colleagues who landed on the moon, to parrots. He said, and parrots don't fly very well. Parrots also don't tell you the truth. They tell you what they're told. At the end of his speech, he turned to the students, because students represent, of course, the next generation. The perfect photo op. Always plant students in your audience so you make people think you're concerned about the next generation. He looked at them, he kind of calmed down at this point, and he said, there are wonders beyond belief on the moon for those who can remove truth's protective layers. Now, I was never taught in school that truth had protective layers. Who's protecting the truth? He was obviously referring to Brookings, to NASA, to 40 years of lies. Okay, a key prediction. Remember, science is nothing if it's not prediction. A key prediction of the whole lunar dome model, the ancient lunar dome model, that somebody was there, they lived there, they built incredible, extensive stuff. Apollo was sent there to find out what they could bring home with the primitive rocket technology of the 1950s and 60s. We're doing a lot better now, by the way, secretly. And one of the key predictions of the model is that if you have glass domes, glass ruins, people who live in glass houses see prisms. They see stunning arrays of color. And if you lived in a glass house and you looked at the sun or you look at the reflections and all that, you should see prisms over and over and over again. In these photographs, the model says that we should be able to find prisms. So I started looking. And this is a picture from Apollo 17. You can just see a hint. This is one of the newly scanned, leaked images that somebody's putting 16 megabyte files. So anybody out there can go to the web and download them and use Photoshop, and bingo, you'll confirm exactly what is there. If you turn up the gain, right up here, above these mountains, which aren't mountains, by the way, they're old eroded ecologies, you find a prism. You find a stunning color shard of glass, spectrally refracting light. Now, in the model that was raised earlier, that this is all done in a soundstage, because sound stages will be made of steel and aluminum and, you know, things you build out of. We don't build out of glass here because glass is fragile. Glass breaks down. Glass is not steel on Earth. Only on the moon is it 20 times stronger than steel. So this, if I had to bet the farm on one piece of data that we're right, it's these prisms. Because in looking at these photographs and looking at the way the color emulsion of the ectochrome, the super ectochrome that Charlie Wyckoff, my friend who I worked with and used this film for him, developed, I know that those three layers, yellow, magenta, and cyan, when converted into a color ectochrome transparency, we're obviously able of recording. Here's another one. This one has a prism going up and a prism going down. It's called birefraction. It's a double refraction. And as you look through, here's a comparison. The one I showed you first, here's the second one. Notice the angle is different. That's because it was taken at a different angle in relation to the sun. So the physics of the refraction, of the formation of the prisms. Here's one of my favorites. This is the PR shot. Cernan wearing the commander's stripes with the flag, but if you look up here in the darkness, in the dome that's over Taurus Littrow, and you enlarge it, lo and behold, you find a prism, a double prism. And you can actually see it's aligned with the stringers in the glass. There's another one here. There's another one up here. These are overwhelming proof, an optical physicist's proof, that what we're seeing is in fact real. Here is probably my favorite. Here is Harrison Schmitt in the moon, lunar landscape, Taurus Littrow Valley, gray landscape, everything we've been told. Here's a color chart, all right? Here's our calibrator, red, green, and blue. This is the grayscale. It's called a gnomon. They would put this out in the photographs to calibrate the color. Well, the color is strangely unsaturated. It's like NASA, when they put these out, they turn down the color. You want to see why? Because when you turn the color back up to the way it should be, bingo, you have sunrise on the moon. You have layered sunrise, just like looking outside here. As you're filming this, look outside, you will see the same layering of light and color under the Earth's atmosphere, except we all know, and we can prove, there is no atmosphere on the moon. Just watch a star as it goes behind the moon some night. It does not twinkle. It disappears like that. So John Lear, dear John, you're wrong. There is no atmosphere on the moon. But there are these huge grids of glass. And when you look in the right way at these pictures, remember, this is an official picture. Not only do you see the color spectrum of a sunrise, but right here, there's this nice, incredible prism made of glass, refracting sunlight back into the camera. And notice the angle. It's almost horizontal because when Saarinen took this picture, the sun was to his back, he was facing almost directly away from the sun, and the geometry of the domes made the prism flat. This, to me, is overwhelming evidence of these ancient lunar domes.